Alright, so let's get this rolling. So my topic was climate change and invasive species. And we're going to be examining the effect of climate change and the rate of invasion of non-native species. The article that I chose was Assessing the Effects of Climate Change on Aquatic Invasive Species by Frank J. Rahel and Julian D. Olden. And this was published in Conservation Biology, a journal. So what we're looking at in particular is freshwater ecosystems and a rise in temperature, global warming. So the hypothesis basically is that, to sum it all up, is that an increase in temperature will lead to an increase in invasive species. So there are a few methodologies that they want to look at in particular, and those were altered thermal regimes, a reduction in ice covering, and an increase in salinity, and how the increase of the climate will affect these areas of ecosystem. So the effect of the altered thermal regimes is basically they will increase the number or the likelihood of invasive species. This is because certain species cannot live in certain temperatures. For example, a polar bear cannot live in subtropical Florida. So with the water temperatures increasing, certain species can increase their habitat and move more forward or expand their range, and therefore stepping into the field or the range or the habitat of species that were once not introduced to these. Invasion. Oops. So the reduction of ice is one major aspect of the climate change. And what this happens to freshwater ecosystems, and what happens is that there's an increased sunlight because there's no more ice covering the bottom, covering the top, and sunlight can now finally reach down to the bottom. And with this, there's an increase in oxygen because new plants are growing and aquatic forests are sprouting up. And also during the winter times, one interesting aspect is that they found is that predation is also increased, times of predation. And another aspect that they looked at was the effects of increased salinity. So with increased salinity, it's obviously a warmer climate, and the resulting effect on precipitation and the amount of snow increases the rate of desiccation, dryness pretty much. And this alters the salinity of freshwater and estuary ecosystems. After it's all done, the conclusion I felt like this was the best way to sum it all up, was that climate change may force a redefinition of invasive species. What this means is that we usually think that invasive species, means non-native, but due to a change in climate, ranges and habitats of certain species are expanding. So they're not necessarily, for lack of a better term, invading. They're just going to their new area. So that was the major conclusion of the research. But yes, the hypothesis was correct that an increase in temperature would lead to an increase in invasive species. Now, what I want to look at was, how will these native species respond from an evolutionary aspect? Will they flat out die? Or, will some mutation in their genetic makeup come out through, through after generations and eventually beat out the invasive species, or what will happen? So that's what I want to look at in particular. And I felt like I could do this I would first collect samples of the native species in an environment where there are no invasion species or invasive organisms, and I'll collect the native species in an environment where there are, and monitor them where they are where there are invasive species. So I would, let them breed and generations document them, and I would just observe for any mutations in the native species. So my hypothesis would be that they would co-evolve. So through co-evolution, both the native species and the invasive species would evolve, will have new traits, because the invasive species, the new species, they are new to this area, new to the new habitat, new ecosystem, and they will have to adapt. And same goes for the native species. There's a new species, maybe a new competition, so certain things might have to adapt and change. And the conclusion could be correct. I mean, my conclusion, it could be like I have a positive result where the hypothesis is correct and coevolution does occur, or I could have a negative result and basically all the native species die off, or they're not able to compete with the invasive species and die off. The broad impact of all this, the big picture, is that, why is this all even important? Why? Well, it's important because it has a major effect on our ecosystems, invasive species, and what happens. I don't know if you guys remember the snakehead back in the Potomac River, and that was affecting a lot of the native fish and destroying. Basically, the snakehead was eating everything in its path, and destroying the ecosystem of Chesapeake Bay, Potomac River, and other local water bodies. And so, also, what if there's an invasive crop plant that hits the U.S. that overtakes everything? Corn, for example, wouldn't be able to be grown because this invasive crop or this invasive plant takes up all the space, or it doesn't allow, corn to grow, or other things such as tomatoes, vegetables, etc. So it's very important, because if it was to hit home, we would need something how to take care of this. We would need previous research, how to predict what would happen, how to fight things off, etc. And also, one aspect is that this isn't one aspect of evolution research that's not covered much is that and one new pathway of evolutionary research that a lot of people, or there's not much research on, is how that native species how they adapt to invasive species, or will they evolve based on the fact that there is a new species, invasive species, in the presence. So, in essence, it leads to a new pathway of evolutionary research. Thank you for enjoying my presentation, and have a great day.
Yeah.